Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. Hope you're all having a fantastic day, and it's time to once again do another movie review. If you've already seen my channel previously, you know I reviewed Friday the 13th and Friday the 13th Part 2. Definitely two films that go perfectly together. They both got the same rating. Today I'm going to be talking about Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D from 1982, the third installment in the Friday the 13th franchise. This movie went in a bit of a different direction with the location and the characters. In the previous films, we saw camp counselors, we saw the summer camp, Camp Crystal Lake. This movie does not have anything to do with a summer camp. It actually takes place in a cabin in the woods called Higgins Haven, I think it is. And it's basically a bunch of people coming together on a vacation. And the main character, Chris, who's played by Diana Kimmel, she basically has got a bit of a troubled past and she's coming out to face her fears, and she is reunited with her former boyfriend Rick. And along the way, in the beginning of the movie, Jason Voorhees has survived the encounter in the previous film, and he's made his way to this nearby store where he kills these two people, and then he moves over to where Chris is going with her friends, and he's lurking in the barn across from the cabin, and he kills people off one at a time. And he even manages to attract the attention of bikers, actually due to one of the characters, Shelly, who had lured the bikers there after Shelly got into an altercation with a few of them at the store. And the bikers come to the place with the intent to cause problems for the characters, such as Chris and Shelly and Rick. And they soon realized they had a much bigger problem on their hands when they lurked into the barn, and they were killed off by Jason one by one. And it's basically the similar thing with the previous films. Jason's just lurking in this barn. He's got all these weapons in there. Jason is played by stuntman Richard Brooker, and he's actually a bit more menacing than Warrington Gillette and Steve Daskowitz in the previous films. And Steve Miner has returned to direct this movie. He was the director in the previous movie, Friday the 13th Part 2. And this movie is actually famous because for the very first time, Jason gets his legendary hockey mask. Now, the hockey mask was actually brought into the barn by Shelly, who had actually scared this girl that he liked, and she chewed him out for it. And he wanders into the barn after hearing a noise, and you don't see what happened to him until later on when Shelly comes walking in, and he's actually got his throat slit, and he's trying to warn his one of his friends. He falls down to the ground and dies, and his friend doesn't believe that this is really even legit because Shelly was actually a character that had played, let's be honest, some cruel jokes on some of his friends. You know, he'd pretend to scare them, he would play dead, and he ends up having his own karma visit on him. And Jason manages to finally come after Chris, who actually reveals that she was attacked years prior by somebody that she actually did not know was Jason Voorhees. And Jason manages to kill Rick, and then he sets his sights on Chris. Very big cat and mouse chase that breaks out, similar to the previous films. And it comes down to that moment where Chris is locked in the barn, and she manages to briefly hang Jason, and then she goes down to try to get out of the barn and sees Jason's body just sitting there, and then he comes to, and then she goes, "You can't be alive." And then he pulls the mask off for the first time, and she realizes that he was the one that attacked her years previously. So this basically lays the work for Chris trying to get away from Jason, and because of this encounter, Chris goes completely insane at the end of the movie. She's taken away in the car, and Jason's body is in the barn where he got the axe in the head, and they roll the credits. But right before that, Chris had actually gotten into this canoe and went across this little pond, and Mrs. Voorhees popped out of the lake and grabbed her, and that's what caused her to go even more insane. And it's basically a nice little nod to the first film when Alice was pulled into the water by Jason as a child, and they kind of recreated it, but they altered certain things around. And, it was a really nice little nod to the previous film, or the previous films, the first film. But this movie is actually a bit different because it's kind of strange to not see Camp Crystal Lake. It's just some cabin in a barn. And the characters really were just kind of average, although I like Shelley. The character of Rick was all right. He actually had a very, very bizarre death. He had his skull crushed, and they actually did this thing where an eye had popped right out of his head, and he just fell down to the ground. And that was really kind of a weird kill, but it really shows that Jason has gotten a bit stronger despite he wasn't yet the zombie killer. He was still a deformed human killer. He could run, he could feel pain, he could bleed, and he could actually die. And Jason gets the axe in the head. And actually, a lot of people really don't remember this or maybe don't know this. This was actually the film that was to be the end of Jason permanently. They were not going to bring him back, and they actually scrapped that idea. And this movie was really remembered for its 3D with the glasses that people could bring into the movie theaters, and you could see like the audience that apparently had watched it, they had actually jumped in certain kills, like the eyeball that Rick had, it went right out into the camera, into the theater, and it scared people. And you have the other character there that actually had been walking on his hands upside down, and this was my favorite kill. And he comes walking out on his hands, and he comes to a pause, and he looks up, and Jason just sits there with the machete, and he goes right down and hacks him right in half. Very, very gruesome kill. Richard Brooker as Jason was actually a very believable Jason. He was more menacing. He was a bit more. He was a bit more built, and he actually looked a bit stronger than the previous stuntmen. The character of Chris was all right. I kind of think this was a weird outcome for a main character after facing Jason, that a character went absolutely insane. Where Ginny Field in the previous movie, despite she was physically attacked, she seemed to be mentally perfectly fine. And you even have Alice in the first movie who survived Mrs. Voorhees. But even in the beginning of the second movie, you could see she was still traumatized over her encounter with Mrs. Voorhees. But Chris was really at this point gone. Um, this movie, it really was the same typical Friday the 13th. The kills were gruesome. The 3D concept was all right. The characters were kind of average like the previous movies. I did enjoy the cat and mouse game between Jason and Chris at the end of the movie. I thought that was really, really something that really makes these movies really memorable. How the hero must try to use a hit and move assault on Jason to try to stay away from him, because Jason at this point, he gets more stronger as these movies goes forward. And this movie was pretty well done. I mean, I don't know if I would put it on the same level of one and two, but I do think it came pretty close. I know people were not really big about the 3D concept back then. I didn't have a problem with it, but again, I wasn't really, in the horror movies, because this was already in 1982 when I was way too young to see these movies. Um, Jason really was more stronger and more lethal in this movie. He's more stealthy, like, in the previous movies, but this one, he really kind of lurks in a barn the whole time, and he is able to avoid being seen. Like, one of the bikers actually wandered in, and you could see Jason lurking in the background, and the person has no idea that Jason's in there with them. Um, Overall, this movie actually was pretty good. And I think this movie, despite it's not the best, but it was okay. It took some time to get used to the location where the movie was made. And again, it's a bit weird because you don't see a summer camp or camp counselors, and they kind of broke away from that and just started having Jason go to other parts of Crystal Lake, and he's going after people, one of whom he has a history with. And this movie, I think I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5 stars. I mean, I still think one and two were better, but this one, it was okay. I don't think it's the best. I sure as hell don't think it's the worst, but it was okay. Tell me what you guys think in the comments section down below. Hit the subscribe button if you're brand new to the channel. Thanks again for watching. I will do more of the reviews on some of the other films in the next several weeks ahead and days ahead if I have time. But this movie, tell me what you think about it in the comments section. Please hit the subscribe button. I'll talk to you guys later, and I'm out of here.